You have no place here. I ate on the steps while the family laughed at the table. Now they eat in my dining room. But they don't laugh anymore. They know who I became and who they were. Growing up in my grandmother's house felt like living in a hierarchy I never asked to be part of. The dining room table was this massive oak thing that could seat 12 people easily, but somehow there was never room for me. Every Sunday, every holiday, every birthday celebration, the same ritual played out. The adults would gather around that table like it was some sacred space, and I'd be stationed by the door like a servant waiting for scraps. The first time I tried to sit down, I was maybe 7 years old. My grandmother was serving her famous pot roast, and the smell was driving me crazy with hunger. I saw an empty chair between my cousin and my aunt, so I climbed up and settled in, thinking finally I'd get to be part of the real dinner. My uncle looked at me like I'd just tracked mud across his freshly waxed floor. He didn't even hesitate before saying those words that burned into my memory. The chair breaks from such skinny misery. Everyone laughed. Not the kind of laugh you share with someone, but the kind that cuts right through you. My grandmother didn't defend me. She just pointed toward the kitchen and told me to make myself a plate and find somewhere else to eat. So I did what I always did. I took my food to the front steps and ate alone, listening to their voices drift through the screened door. They'd tell stories, share gossip, laugh at jokes I'd never hear the punchline to. Sometimes I'd catch fragments of conversation about neighbors or work drama, but mostly it was just the sound of belonging to something I wasn't welcome in. The pattern continued for years. Thanksgiving meant eating turkey on the porch while they carved the wishbone inside. Christmas meant unwrapping my single gift in the hallway while they opened presents by the tree. My birthday wasn't acknowledged at all. It fell in February, and they said it was too cold for celebrations. I learned to make myself small, to disappear into corners, to expect nothing because expecting hurt too much. By the time I turned 15, I'd stopped showing up to family dinners altogether. My grandmother would ask where I was, but in this absent way, like she was checking off a list rather than actually caring about the answer. My uncle would shrug and say I was probably sulking somewhere, and that would be the end of it. Nobody came looking for me. Nobody saved me a plate. I'd hear them through the walls of my tiny bedroom, their laughter echoing through the house while I ate cereal for dinner and did homework by lamplight. High school became my escape route. I threw myself into everything: clubs, volunteer work, part-time jobs, anything that kept me away from that house and those people. I worked at the local grocery store after school, stocking shelves and learning about responsibility from managers who treated me better than my own family ever had. The other employees would invite me to their barbecues and birthday parties, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it felt like to be wanted somewhere. When graduation came around, my family showed up to the ceremony. They sat in the back row and left immediately after, not bothering to congratulate me or take pictures. That night, there was no celebration dinner, no acknowledgement of the achievement. I ate leftover pizza alone in my room while they watched television downstairs, discussing my cousin's college acceptance like it was the most important thing that had ever happened to our family. Update 1. The day I turned 18, I had 3 suitcases packed and a plan. I'd saved every penny from my grocery store job, and I had enough for a security deposit on a small apartment across town. Moving out wasn't dramatic or emotional, it was just practical. I waited until they were all at Sunday dinner, that familiar scene playing out without me as usual, and I simply left. I took my clothes, my books, my few personal belongings, and I walked out of that house forever. Nobody called to ask where I'd gone. Nobody reported me missing. I found out later from a neighbor that it took them 3 days to even notice I wasn't there anymore. My grandmother mentioned to someone at the grocery store that the house felt quieter, but not in a way that suggested she missed me. More like she'd finally gotten rid of an annoying noise she'd learned to tolerate. The first few years on my own were harder than I'd expected, but they were mine. I worked full-time while taking night classes at the community college, studying business administration because it seemed practical and stable. My apartment was tiny, just a studio with a kitchenette and a fold-out couch, but it was the first space I'd ever had that belonged completely to me. I could eat at my small table whenever I wanted. I could invite friends over without asking permission. I could exist without apologizing for taking up space. College led to better jobs, and better jobs led to opportunities I'd never dreamed of. I discovered I had a talent for understanding what people needed and figuring out how to provide it. I started with basic customer service roles, then moved into account management, then project coordination. Each position taught me something new about how the world worked outside my grandmother's house. I learned that most people were decent if you treated them with respect. I learned that hard work actually got recognized in the real world. I learned that my opinion mattered to people who didn't share my DNA. By my mid-20s, I'd worked my way up to managing a small team at a marketing firm. The work was challenging and engaging, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was good at something important. My colleagues became the family I'd chosen for myself. We'd go out for drinks after difficult projects, celebrate each other's promotions, support each other through breakups and family dramas. When they talked about their own complicated family relationships, I mostly listened. My story felt too heavy to share, too pathetic to explain. During this time, I met someone who changed how I saw myself entirely. She was brilliant and kind, with this amazing ability to see the best in people even when they couldn't see it themselves. She came from one of those families that actually liked each other. They had weekly dinners and group vacations and inside jokes that included everyone. Being around her family was like visiting another planet where people genuinely enjoyed each other's company. She never pushed me to talk about my own family, but she'd ask gentle questions sometimes. Where did I grow up? Did I have any siblings? What were holidays like when I was little? I'd give brief, non-committal answers that didn't invite follow-up questions. The few times I tried to explain what my childhood had actually been like, the words came out wrong. It sounded like I was exaggerating or playing for sympathy. How do you explain to someone from a loving family that your own relatives treated you like an unwelcome houseguest for 18 years? Update 2. Everything changed when I was 28. The marketing firm I'd been working for got acquired by a larger company, and suddenly I found myself with a severance package and a decision to make. I could look for another similar job, or I could take the risk I'd been thinking about for years and start my own consulting business. The woman I'd been dating encouraged me to take the leap. She believed in me in a way that felt foreign but incredible. Starting my own business was terrifying and exhilarating. I specialized in helping small companies develop better customer relationships and streamline their operations. It turned out that all those years of being ignored and overlooked had taught me to pay attention to details other people missed. I could see when someone felt excluded or undervalued, and I knew how to fix those problems because I lived them myself. The business grew faster than I dared to hope. Within 2 years, I had 6 employees and more clients than I could handle alone. Within 4 years, I'd expanded to 2 offices and was considering franchising opportunities. The financial success felt surreal after growing up with so little, but what really surprised me was how much I enjoyed the leadership aspect. Creating an environment where people felt valued and heard became my passion project. My personal life was thriving too. The woman I'd been dating became my wife in a small ceremony attended by our chosen family of friends and colleagues. Her parents welcomed me like I'd always belonged with them, asking about my business and remembering details from previous conversations. Her father taught me how to grill properly. Her mother sent me recipes and birthday cards. For the first time in my adult life, I understood what it meant to be part of a family that actually functioned. We bought a house in a quiet neighborhood with good schools, thinking ahead to the future we were planning together. It was a beautiful colonial with a large dining room that could easily seat 12 people. The irony wasn't lost on me. I now owned the kind of space I'd been excluded from my entire childhood. My wife would joke about hosting big dinner parties, and I'd smile and agree, but something inside me always clenched up at the thought of filling that dining room with people. For 10 years, I'd had no contact with my birth family. I didn't know if my grandmother was still alive, if my uncle still lived in the same house, if my cousins had gotten married or had children of their own. Sometimes I'd see people who looked familiar at the grocery store or the mall, and I'd feel this strange mixture of panic and curiosity. But I never approached them, and if they recognized me, they never said anything either. The first contact came through social media, of all places. Maya sent me a friend request on a platform I barely used, along with a message saying she'd found my profile through mutual connections. The message was carefully neutral, just saying she hoped I was doing well and that the family thought about me sometimes. I stared at that message for days before responding with an equally careful note saying I was fine and hoped everyone was healthy. That small exchange opened a floodgate I hadn't expected. Over the next few months, other family members reached out with similar messages. My grandmother had apparently been asking about me more frequently, wondering if anyone had heard from me or knew what I was doing with my life. My uncle had mentioned seeing my name in a local business publication and seemed surprised that I'd done well for myself. The messages were awkward and tentative, full of the kind of small talk you make with acquaintances rather than relatives. Nobody mentioned the past directly, but there were hints that things had changed. My uncle had apparently gone through some health problems that had made him more reflective about family relationships. One of my cousins had gotten divorced and was struggling financially. My grandmother was in her 80s now and had started talking about legacy and reconciliation. Update 3. The breakthrough moment came when my grandmother's 90th birthday approached. My aunt called me directly, not hiding behind social media messages anymore, to ask if I'd consider coming to the celebration. Her voice sounded older, more fragile than I remembered, and there was something in her tone that suggested this wasn't just a casual invitation. She mentioned that my grandmother had specifically asked about me, wondering if I might attend. The conversation was stilted and uncomfortable, full of long pauses and careful word choices. My aunt acknowledged that things had been difficult when I was younger, using that vague language people employ when they don't want to admit to specific wrongdoings. She said everyone hoped we could find a way to be family again, that too much time had passed for old grievances to matter anymore. I didn't commit to anything during that phone call, but something about it stuck with me for weeks afterward. My wife encouraged me to consider going, pointing out that I might regret missing the opportunity if my grandmother passed away without us reconciling. She also gently suggested that showing up from a position of strength and success might give me the closure I'd never gotten as a powerless child. After much deliberation, I decided to take control of the situation in a way that felt safe for me. Instead of simply attending their celebration, I offered to host the birthday dinner at my house. I told my aunt that my dining room could accommodate everyone comfortably, and I'd handle all the catering and arrangements. The offer surprised them, but they agreed quickly, probably relieved not to have to organize everything themselves. Planning that dinner became an obsession for me. I hired a professional catering company that specialized in elegant family-style meals. I bought new china and crystal, rearranged furniture to create the perfect flow from the living room to the dining room, selected flowers and candles that would create exactly the right atmosphere. My wife watched me with a mixture of support and concern as I threw myself into details that probably didn't matter to anyone but me. The night before the dinner, I barely slept. I kept walking through the house, adjusting place settings and checking that everything was perfect. My wife found me in the dining room at 3 in the morning, staring at the long table I'd set for 12 people. She didn't say anything, just put her hand on my shoulder and stood with me in the quiet darkness. The day of the dinner, they arrived exactly on time, which somehow felt significant. I watched through the front window as they got out of their cars and walked up my driveway, taking in the well-maintained lawn and the expensive vehicles in my garage. My uncle looked older and heavier than I remembered. My aunt seemed nervous, fidgeting with her purse and looking around like she was cataloging everything she saw. My grandmother moved slowly but with dignity, leaning on a walker but still maintaining the posture of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. I greeted them at the door with the kind of polite warmth I'd learned to deploy in business situations. I showed them around the house, pointing out features and improvements with the same tone I'd use for potential clients. They complimented everything appropriately, but there was an undercurrent of shock in their responses. I don't think they'd expected me to have done so well for myself, to have created something so obviously successful and stable. The dining room reveal was everything I'd hoped it would be. The table was set beautifully, with the kind of attention to detail that comes from hiring professionals who understand how to create an impressive presentation. The food was restaurant quality, elegantly plated, and perfectly timed. I'd positioned myself at the head of the table, in the spot that had never been offered to me as a child, and gestured for them to take their seats around me. The meal itself was surreal. They ate quietly, complimenting the food and making small talk about the weather and neighborhood. But there was a tension underneath everything, a recognition that this wasn't just a birthday dinner, but some kind of reckoning. My uncle kept glancing around the room like he was calculating the cost of everything he saw. My aunt barely made eye contact, focusing intently on her plate whenever conversation lagged. My grandmother seemed the most at ease, perhaps because her advanced age gave her permission to speak more directly than the others. She mentioned how proud she was that I'd done so well for myself, how she'd always known I was smart and capable. The words would have meant everything to me 20 years earlier, but now they felt hollow and self-serving. She was rewriting history to make herself feel better about how she'd treated me, and we all knew it. As the evening progressed, the weight of all those years of exclusion and dismissal settled over the table like fog. Nobody mentioned the past directly, but it was there in every careful word choice, every awkward pause, every moment when someone started to speak and then thought better of it. They were seeing me in my element, successful and confident and in control, and they were remembering the skinny, hungry child they'd pushed away from their table year after year. The moment that had been building all evening finally arrived when I stood up to offer a toast for my grandmother's birthday. I held my glass high and looked around the table at each face, taking my time, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Then I spoke the words I'd been rehearsing in my head for weeks, words that were both gracious and devastating. I thanked them for teaching me in childhood not to become like them. The silence that followed was deafening. My grandmother's hand trembled as she set down her glass. My uncle's face went red, then pale. My aunt started to say something, then stopped. The birthday cake sat untouched in the center of the table as everyone absorbed what I just said and what it meant. They left shortly after that, making polite excuses about getting home at a reasonable hour. My grandmother kissed my cheek and whispered something about hoping we could talk again soon, but her voice lacked conviction. My uncle shook my hand with the kind of grip that suggested he was still trying to establish dominance, even in defeat. My aunt hugged me awkwardly and said the dinner had been lovely, which was true enough on the surface. After they left, my wife and I sat in our beautiful dining room surrounded by the remnants of the most expensive and emotionally charged meal I'd ever hosted. She asked how I felt, and I realized I didn't know how to answer that question. There was satisfaction in having shown them who I'd become despite their treatment of me. There was closure in finally being able to articulate what their behavior had cost me. But there was also a profound sadness that it had taken 30 years and complete financial independence for me to feel safe enough to speak my truth to them. In the weeks that followed, none of them reached out to me. No thank you calls for hosting the dinner, no follow-up conversations about what I'd said, no attempts to explain or apologize for the past. The silence felt familiar in a way that was both comforting and disappointing. They'd shown me exactly who they were when I was a child, and that dinner confirmed they hadn't fundamentally changed. They were still people who could only relate to others through power dynamics and social positioning. My wife suggested that maybe I'd gotten what I needed from that evening, the chance to face them as an equal and say what I'd always wanted to say. She was probably right, but part of me had hoped for something more. Not reconciliation exactly, but perhaps some acknowledgement of the damage they'd done, some recognition that their treatment of me had been cruel and unnecessary. Instead, I got exactly what I'd expected deep down, the confirmation that they were still the same people who could exclude a child from family dinners and laugh about it. The only difference was that now I had the power to exclude them from mine, and unlike them, I'd found the grace to invite them in before shutting the door forever. The house felt different after that dinner, like it had finally become fully mine in a way it hadn't been before. The dining room no longer felt like a space haunted by childhood dreams of belonging. It was simply a beautiful room in a beautiful house that I'd earned through my own efforts, filled with furniture I'd chosen and memories I'd created with people who actually valued my presence. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if they'd responded differently to my toast that night. If my uncle had acknowledged his cruelty, if my aunt had apologized for her complicity, if my grandmother had admitted that she'd failed me when I needed her most, would I have been capable of forgiveness? Would we have found a way to build something real from the wreckage of all those years? But those are hypothetical questions about people who don't exist. The family members who came to my house that night were the same ones who'd pushed me away from their table as a child, just older and less powerful. They hadn't developed empathy or insight or remorse in the intervening decades. They'd simply learned to be more careful about their cruelty when it might have consequences for them. The real victory wasn't in hosting that dinner or delivering that toast, though both felt necessary at the time. The real victory was in building a life so full and satisfying that their absence from it felt like relief rather than loss. I created the family I'd always wanted with my wife and friends and colleagues who chose to be in my life because they enjoyed my company, not because they were obligated by genetics to tolerate my presence. My dining room table hosts different gatherings now, business dinners with colleagues who respect my opinion, holiday celebrations with friends who laugh with me rather than at me, quiet Sunday meals with my wife where we plan our future and share our dreams. The child who ate alone on the front steps would be amazed to see what his life became, not because of the material success, but because of the emotional abundance he never dared to imagine possible. The last communication I received from any of them was a Christmas card from my aunt the following year. It was generic and impersonal, the kind of card you send to distant acquaintances to maintain minimal social connection. Inside, she'd written a brief note hoping I was well and mentioning that my grandmother often spoke fondly of me. There was no invitation to visit, no suggestion of future contact, no acknowledgement of what had transpired at that birthday dinner. I didn't send a card back, and I haven't heard from them since. Sometimes I see updates about their lives through mutual acquaintances or social media connections, who got married, who had health problems, who moved to different cities. I absorbed this information with the mild interest I might have for the lives of former classmates or distant neighbors. They've become people I used to know rather than family I'm connected to, and that transformation feels like the healthiest possible outcome. The story could end there, with that sense of resolution and moving forward. But life rarely provides such clean endings, and there was one more chapter to this saga that I couldn't have anticipated. 3 years after that birthday dinner, I received news that my grandmother had passed away. The information came through the same social media channels that had initially reconnected us, a brief message from a cousin I barely remembered asking if I'd heard about the funeral arrangements. I didn't attend the funeral, but I did something that surprised even me. I sent flowers to the service with a card that simply said, "Thank you for the lessons." It was ambiguous enough that they could interpret it however they chose, but I knew what I meant by it. She had taught me lessons, just not the ones she'd intended. She'd show me what family dysfunction looked like, how cruelty could hide behind tradition, how exclusion could be disguised as discipline. More importantly, she'd motivated me to become someone completely different from the people who'd raised me. Every success in my adult life could be traced back to my determination not to replicate the patterns I'd experienced as a child. Every kindness I'd shown to employees or friends or strangers was partly motivated by my memory of how it felt to be dismissed and ignored by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. In the end, they'd given me the greatest gift possible, though they'd never intended it as such. They'd show me exactly who I didn't want to become, and that clarity had guided every major decision I'd made since leaving their house at 18. My marriage was built on mutual respect and genuine affection because I'd experienced the alternative. My business succeeded because I understood how to make people feel valued and included. My friendships were deep and lasting because I never took anyone's presence in my life for granted. The dining room table where I delivered that final toast has hosted hundreds of meals since then, each one a celebration of the life I'd built from scratch after walking away from the people who couldn't see my worth. Sometimes I think about that skinny child eating alone on the front steps, and I wish I could tell him that someday he'd have his own table, surrounded by people who chose to be there, laughing at jokes he was part of rather than excluded from. But maybe he already knew that somehow. Maybe that's why he had the strength to keep going through all those lonely dinners and silent birthdays and ignored achievements. Maybe he understood, even then, that their rejection of him said everything about who they were and nothing about who he could become. The table where I sit now, surrounded by love and laughter and genuine connection, is proof that he was right to believe in a different kind of future, even when he couldn't yet imagine what it might look like.